So I'll stop now. Thank you. Sorry for going on so long. Do we have time for questions or discussion?
Yes, please.
Garen?
The examples you used were, the examples are in some sense that, the authors of those examples might not want to admit to. They're kind of defensive in some sense or evasive. And I wonder if there's distinctions to be made with respect to your thesis about form, that would distinguish, make category distinction between those types, for example, and a kind of aggressive, very visible, manifesto-driven kind of avant-gardism, where there's some sense where there's some statement about form which says prevailing forms no longer serve our purposes. We have to find new forms. Is there something there?
Well, I mean, even though Foucault ends with the battle of forms, I'm not that interested. I'm interested in the battle of forms, not in a kind of avant-gardist kind of constant displacement. I'm interested, though, in forms as the terms under which a cultural artifact circulates in the world, carries various kinds of information with it, bumps up against other forms, interconnects with them. And so I mean form almost, I don't want to say container because it's not just that, but it's more than just form as in an art history sense. Certainly there are battles, but a lot of it is less the battle than the kind of mundane process of the mundane social life of a cultural artifact and the way in which its form is a key determinant of its mode of being in the world and in the multiplicity of relations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
I disagree. No. 20. Well, I always subtract 10. Thanks.
But I was both impressed and once you started going on, from the first examples of transnational circulation, I was thinking of how and your arguments, from the four examples that you gave. And how that affects positioning in cultural studies. Not only do I totally agree with you, but there's so many other ways in which that has been apparent. We could say that at one point, not just, the circulation of video art that in Canada was narrative for a long period of time. Suddenly the narrative got dropped off as people wanted to export their...
Oh, interesting.
It wasn't about English. It was exporting videotapes to other parts of the world, right? And language, and there are many examples of it. But I think what I liked most about it, and I promise not to steal it, was the sort of theoretical ideas behind it, because we can, with that sort of as an armature, we can actually look at. But as a methodology, I think I really enjoyed what you have to say and the way that you said it, because I think it's productive for many of our programs.
Thank you. I mean, where I get in trouble, of course, is because I kind of, if you read particularly the article by Guéoncar and Povinelli, which is really a manifesto, it is really against interpretation. It is really against the idea that cultural analysis is about the struggle over meaning. Who really wants to give all of that up, the idea that cultural analysis is about the struggle of meaning? I'm happy to push it as far as I'm interested in, which is pretty far, but a little part of me wants to hang on to the struggle of meaning, and for lots of other people, they want to hold on to a much bigger part of that. I think in media communication studies, we've been bogged down by the struggle over meaning and less attentive to these other processes, the movements of forms and so on. But I mean, their article, like a lot of others, Hans, Gumbrecht and others, they're, arguments against, Gumbrecht says that we have to get away from the idea that the text is the site for us, I forget it, I can't remember what it is, but...
But where interpretation comes in that, it's I don't want to claim its
Yeah.
And I always see some of what you're saying about interpretation to be around value and not belonging, and I think the belonging on that axis, right? And there's been a lot of focus, obviously, in smaller, not smaller, but whatever you call this particular type of nation state on belonging.
Yeah, I mean, what I ask my students was, with every artifact, how does that artifact express its relationship to other places? Its belonging is not simply its roots, but it's even more its positionality. And any Canadian artifact, and any artifact anywhere, you could do that. But it's particularly resonant in the case of Canada. I mean, Ira Wagman, who's a media scholar at Carleton, starts talking about the Auto Pact that basically prescribed how much, when cars are made in Canada, how much American content has to be in them. And that's actually the origin of Canadian content regulations for television. Well, when you start thinking of every cultural artifact as some proportion or of things from here and somewhere else, then its positionality, the manner and degree of its belonging, I think, is central to its very assembledness. I think, as I did with those 4 quotes, I'm hijacking what you said for some other purpose. But yeah.
I'm curious. Going back to what you said about relationships and temporality, and looking at the examples of the broader remedies and signs of Canada coming after something creating much more culturally centralized.
Central.
The kind of culture the U.S. has. You referred very briefly to contexts like Canada creating things sooner rather than later, and that itself having an effect for it.
Well, you hit on a real weakness. As I was writing this, I thought I can't always imply that it's always Canada being behind. So maybe there are cases where policy pushes for something, but it sort of isn't. The audiences or the social world are not ready yet. But I couldn't actually think of any examples. And I thought if I read it quickly, maybe nobody will know. No, but I mean, if I start to think about film policy and the drive to build an English-Canadian feature film audience, because in Quebec they built a fairly successful popular feature film audience. To say we're not ready, is that it? I mean, it's something else. But there's a way in which production is ahead of the emergence of a public that knows what to do with it or wants anything to do with it or something like that. So I thank you for forcing me to return to that point. And finding further examples of that, I think, would be useful for me and hopefully interesting to others. About which? I'm sorry. Yeah, Papa.
I was wondering if, because you're talking about using English probably to reach a different public, but do you know, has he ever tried in his early career to sing in French, and was that?
Oh no, he did. But he did. He did in a time in the 1960s where, if you were interested, if you were frankly quite interested in Johnny Mathis, hearing him, you would go and hear someone else who sounded like him. The same way, lots of Quebecois groups would do Beatles songs and so on, and you would buy the Quebec version. By 1965, everybody would just buy the Beatles or they'd buy Johnny Mathis, and that sense of a two-step process whereby music was translated into Quebec into local versions and so on had disappeared, and his career suffered from the collapse of that system momentarily. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Because he did sing in French, yeah, and I just saw him last César in a little room with a whole bunch of group of musicians and young stars basically singing sort of classics of French chansons. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just thinking that I didn't know you had to concede so quickly about having given up on interpretation, because couldn't this kind of method you're talking about as being kind of the imperialism of interpretation, because it's applying interpretive modes to modes of production, kind of, saying, okay, we can see those as cultural forms. We actually have tools to talk about them that are different from, let's say.
You're right, and I think it's usually because when people say we need to bring together political economy and cultural studies, they mean cultural studies people need to know how the world works and companies work. I think people who do political economy need to know about how commodities work as texts and as texts, yeah.
My question is a more kind of fundamental one, which is just what you think about the film whose title I've forgotten, about the Quebec disco scene that came out last year.
Funky Town.
Yeah, what was it?
I quite liked it. I had low expectations, and I've been interviewed for so many documentaries that never happened on the Quebec disco scene and radio documentaries that did. What I thought, and the film got in trouble, as you may know, in the Francophone press for showing the disco world as one where there was lots of English spoken. I wasn't in the disco scene then, but I visited enough clubs at the time to know that as a downtown Montreal scene, it was quite bilingual. The film is pretty good because it's got a kind of cheesy narrative and so on, but it kind of hits all the historical forces and so on. It's not bad. Yeah. Did you see it?
Yeah, I was just curious.
What did you think?
Its veracity, or its, it did seem to evoke
Yeah.
climate very richly, but I had no idea how to assess.
And all the central characters, except for the core couple, romantic couple, are based on, I can tell you who each of them was. Yeah.
Thanks. It was very interesting. I have one comment and then I have a question. With the comments, I think that you already started to answer in this discussion round. That certainly when you got your shirt print, you'll nuance the, a definition of Canadian and U.S., right? Because, there's so many ways in which it doesn't work. At the same time that you point out that there are ways that it can work.
Yeah, and my biggest sort of fear in all this is that how do you talk about these things without essentializing them? Now, if we're talking about actors and so on, it's they belong to unions. They have careers within industries that are quite. National borders divide those quite well. But cultural studies, and if it wasn't that, years of trying to think it isn't the case that Canadians and U.S. do it differently, and just constantly bumping up at the ways in which most of the time they do, that I just thought I might as well say it with 1,000 qualifications, but not 1,000,000 qualifications, because that just gets tiresome.
The other part that's actually more a question is, I was struck by the argument, the point that you were making about the high production value images, and then I'll just say cheap Canadian knockoff. And I was thinking it seems to me it could be quite productive to talk about what that means, because the way it came off for me as a listener was more that there's the authentic version, and then there's the less than authentic version, and if we could get out of that logic and instead say there are two different versions, and then you could talk about the two different versions and show exactly what you were talking about, which is how they're produced culturally, and then how they're received culturally and produced culturally, and how also the economics and politics plays into that.
No, that's very good advice. Yeah. Because of course, the Canadian one comes after, so it's going to be like a photocopy. There's going to be some loss of definition, even if Canada was the leading producer of magazines at that point. The simple passes, but it's also there's an aging that manifests itself, and then the whole object in which it appears already, even without the image, is that they're all cheap versions of things that 5 years ago had already been minor and quasi-legal in the United States. So there are multiple forms of degradation.
I'm thinking about the beauty of, in the case of German canonical literature, there are these really cheap things that cost like €1. You get like Goethe for €1. It's cheap, but wow, it's great.
Yeah, sure.
Everybody can read it, and everybody can have it fall in the swimming pool, and it doesn't matter. And isn't that an amazing difference compared to the hardbound, very expensive that not everybody can afford, et cetera, et cetera? As an example.
No, but there's a legitimacy even to those cheap versions because they're part of a democratization
or a different meaning.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's education for everyone, et cetera. It comes from that a whole different trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Everybody's tired and wants to go to the party, or wants to go to the party. Okay.
On behalf of the Undisciplined Committee, thank you so much for joining us, Will.